The idealization phase is when the narcissistic partner is kind of creating this ideal of who they want their victims to believe they are.
Cognitive dissonance, which keeps us stuck because we hold out hope that, okay, we get through the bad phase, but then something good is going to happen.
Future faking is a huge one. And future faking is basically creating plans of a life in the future, right? Like they will make promises of marriage if they know that's something that you want, plans to move in together.
It creates almost a substance abuse like addiction where you're just waiting for that next hit of the good, of the serotonin, of the dopamine. Today, we're talking about the phases of narcissistic relationships. I think an important topic for people who may have found themselves in a relationship like this, and important for people who have been through it so that they can learn to recognize the signs of what these relationships look like as they're starting to put themselves back out there again and can avoid the pitfalls of getting into another situation like that again. So I thought maybe first we could just start by talking about those phases. There's 3 distinct phases of a narcissistic relationship. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, what those phases are and what they look like?
So there are 3 phases of the narcissistic relationship, and you may see this different depending on who you're talking to. I've seen it a couple of ways. I refer to the 3 phases of idealization, devaluation or devalue, and the rejection phase. Some may see visuals circulate around or with the word hoover in that cycle or that phase. But I like to think, or I guess the way my mind works, I think hoovering is an abuse tactic, not necessarily a phase, so that they can continue to maneuver through these cycles or these phases of the relationship. And so the idealization phase is when the narcissistic partner is kind of creating this ideal of who they want their victims to believe they are, right? I call it creating the mask. And in that phase, you can expect grandiose gestures, right? It's also known as the love bombing phase. There's a lot of love bombing that happens in idealization, where they are gathering some information about your past and your, I guess, pain points in previous relationships. And they want to mimic the exact opposite, right? They're trying to gather information to know what kind of partner you want. And they create this mask by giving you the things that maybe you have lacked in previous relationships. And a lot of narcissistic partners will give you lavish gifts, plan elaborate trips. They will do, I guess, extreme acts of service, right? So if they are coming around and remodeling things in your house or showing up at your, basically your knight in shining armor phase, like every ever could have thought in a fairy tale partner, they appear to be that for you. Also in that phase, in terms of what, things that they say to you, they're building you up, right? They want to make you feel like the most appreciated person on the face of the planet. They will tell you things good about yourself. They will make you feel good about yourself. They will learn what your insecurities are and try to build you up based on what they learn about your insecurities, right? And then they will quickly move into the devaluation phase. But the idealization phase, that tactic is to kind of secure you in a relationship and secure you in that relationship as quickly as possible.
One other thing that came to my mind as you were talking about this idealization phase, which you described so well, one thing that came to my mind was future faking. Do you think is that part of that phase too? Yeah.
Good call out. Yeah. I had that in the back of my mind and I started talking and completely skipped on that. But yes, future faking is a huge one. And future faking is basically creating plans of a life in the future, right? Like they will make promises of marriage if they know that's something that you want, plans to move in together, plans on romantic trips, whatever it is to make you long for that future life with them, right? Yeah. They basically are thinking 10 steps ahead so that you fall in love with this ideal And that's exactly what it is it's an ideal. It's not
right,
real.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And
And you
so
mentioned
thank you for pointing that
hoovering
out.
being, yeah, and you mentioned hoovering being a tactic that can be used during this idealization phase, especially after the devaluation and the rejection happens, then the hoovering can occur. And that's what, in case somebody listening isn't familiar with hoovering, it's named that way because it's named after a vacuum cleaner. It's you get sucked back in with these tactics, like you're talking about, the love bomby type stuff is used to hoover you back in. So yeah.
Yeah.
So then
in the
devaluation.
devaluation sorry, Susie, I didn't
No,
mean to cut you off.
no, it's all good. We'll go there
So
next.
quickly after the idealization phase, you'll find yourself in devaluation. And in that phase, the narcissist or the narcissistic partner is creating doubts within their victim.
Oops, we lost her.
They've set this precedent, like the precedence of who they are or who they want us to believe they are. That's when they will kind of flip the switch and start using some of those insecurities. Like if you have confided in them about, I guess, what a past partner may have said to you that made you feel really bad about yourself, right? They will double down on this knowledge that they have of you by reaffirming that insecurity. Like, well, that's why, Joe left you, or that's why now I understand why Joe said those things about you. You really are these things, right? And so we have this concept of who we think this person was, how kind and loving and compassionate they were, that we start to doubt ourselves because that's not who they are, right? Like they don't behave that way for no reason. And so they will start to build this doubt within their victims, and they will subtly start to nitpick at small things, making you feel like you're not good enough, right? Very slowly over time to devalue your sense of being and who you are at your core. And then they will move into rejection phase. And so the rejection phase, it can be a discard, right? Like once a narcissistic person has gotten all that they can out of their victims, a lot of times they will discard them and they will move on to someone new and they will start the phases all over. Rejection doesn't always mean the relationship will end, though, because sometimes that is just part of creating that insecurity within their partner and creating this belief that they're never going to find anyone better than the narcissist, right? And that's when they go into that tactic of hoovering, right? They'll leave for a certain period of time and do all kinds of hurtful things. And then once their victims have moved on or tried to rebuild their lives, they will come back and hoover and start the love bombing phase all over again, right? And that cycle will start over. The idealization will start over, and then they'll do. And so it's just like an ongoing cycle of idealization, devaluation, and then rejection. And so that's
and then rinse and repeat, like you said. It continues until that cycle can be broken.
Yep.
So yeah, really interesting. And I think also interesting is just the impact that these cycles have on the individual who's entrenched in them over time. So I was going to talk about that a little bit. There's many reasons why it can be so difficult to leave these relationships. I think this cycle of abuse is really at the core of that, because these cycles, they keep us entrenched in the relationship. They create what's called cognitive dissonance, where you're having, at the core of that is confusion. You're having these conflicting emotions and feelings about this person because things aren't always bad. You have these moments where things are really great and you're being told all the things you want to hear and you're being treated really well, but then it shifts into that, the devaluation, the rejection. So it creates these really strong feelings of confusion in the person, cognitive dissonance, which keeps us stuck because we hold out hope that, okay, we get through the bad phase, but then something good is going to happen. And maybe this time things have actually changed and they're not going to go back to being bad. So it creates that cognitive dissonance. It also creates almost like a substance use type of an addiction in our brains, because our bodies are constantly being flooded with these good chemicals that come from the good times when we're in that idealization phase. We've got dopamine, we've got serotonin, we've got parts of our brains being activated, the pleasure centers of our brains being activated. But then as you move into those other phases, you have like stress hormones happening. Your bodies are being driven for more primal instincts like fear, anxiety, all of those feelings are kind of driving our behavior. So it creates almost a substance abuse like addiction where you're just waiting for that next hit of the good, of the serotonin, of the dopamine, and it keeps us in these relationships for longer than we want to be in them. So,
and if
is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think that's I could talk forever about that.
Yeah, the brain science part is so interesting. Yeah.
The reason I feel it's important to call this out is because in these relationships, very often when you stay long enough, you get isolated over time, right? And so it's really important to understand that as they're activating those pleasure centers of our brains and we're in isolation, they become our only supply of those good feelings. And so it does something to our bodies, I think, right? Like as I've been reading more about like the betrayal bond and learning and kind of correlating the addiction terminology and the addiction and recovery world with narcissistic abuse and recovering from narcissistic abuse, what I have observed is the pattern is created. Our brains subconsciously, I think, we think that they're the only people who can make us feel better because we've been isolated by this abusive person. So over time, once we're isolated, it's like we've just become so accustomed to needing them for that we don't realize that once we're not in the relationship anymore, whenever we want to leave, it's almost impossible to imagine a life where those feelings are possible without that person. So sorry.
Absolutely. No, that's such a good point. Yeah, definitely. So when you're on the other side of this, you've left the relationship. I know one of the biggest fears I had, as well as what I hear from the women I work with, is there's this fear of getting into a relationship like that again. So I thought we could spend the last bit here just talking about what are some things to think about? What are some ways that people can avoid falling victim to this type of relationship in the future? What comes to mind for you?
So I think if you know that you've been in a relationship like this, and for those of you that are watching live, if you have any questions, I will look through them and Susie and I will try to get to them and answer them.
Yeah,
I see that we have some folks that are tuning in, and this is a really good, I feel like, segue into asking, because a lot of people have that question. Yeah. Avoiding relationships, I think, is very important. And I say this because when you get out of a narcissistic relationship, they've basically retrained our brain in really unhealthy ways to identify love with unhealthy behaviors. And I think that's the best way I can phrase it, right? It teaches us to behave in ways that are pleasing of others. And I think the best way to position yourself moving forward is to avoid relationships and kind of take some time to heal, whether it's hiring a coach like myself or Susie, whether it's hiring a therapist or getting into some somatic practices to release some of the trauma that has happened throughout the duration of the relationship. Just really take the time to get to know yourself. And then whenever you are in another relationship with someone new, is to take it slow. Right? Take it slow and understand what narcissistic patterns are and what idealization and love bombing patterns look like so that you don't fall victim again and basically, longing for a person that doesn't really exist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I say that a lot. Time is the biggest indicator of who someone is.
Yes.
We
And
can't.
it's really hard because you get
Yeah.
out of the relationships and you feel so broken
Mhm.
that, and we don't realize that we have the tools. And I mean, I could talk forever about that too, but sometimes we don't realize that we have the tools to fix these things within ourselves first. And
Mhm.
we lean on some more codependent behaviors and thinking that someone is going to love me and make me feel better about myself. And so
Right.
we search endlessly for partners that are potentially going to set us up for another phase of love bombing, to where, you know, if you have that experience so many times, you're going to just be convinced that everyone is a narcissist, right? Like, I just don't want to do relationships anymore because everybody does the same thing over and over and over again.
Right. Your trust level is
Yep.
very
And so
low.
I will say, taking your time, that's one. And then observing how your new partner handles conflict. That is probably hands down the most important for me. And that's like one of the top things that I coach my clients through is, if you feel like a boundary needs to be set, or if a boundary has been violated and you need to express that concern, that is a conflict. And how do they respond to that conflict? That is a really big indicator on the type of person you're dating.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a gal in my meetup group, my local meetup group, who was talking about, she's just starting to dip her toe in dating and is kind of viewing it as an experiment. You know, she's going on these dates without a lot of expectations, but she's using it as a chance for her to use her voice and to express those feelings when they come up. Like, hey, this kind of rubbed me the wrong way, or hey, I really didn't like how this made me feel. And she's been doing that. And she said it's been really interesting to see how some of these people she's gone out with have responded. And she has had situations where the person got defensive or they tried to gaslight her about it. And she was like, nope, this person isn't for me. So it's such a good thing to be thinking about if you're starting to explore dating.
Yeah.
Because the way that people handle conflict or uncomfortable situations is such a good indicator of who they are. But yeah, you have to take things slow. You have to let things unfold. And I don't know, the way I view it, the way I viewed it after starting to date is, if somebody's showering me with all these compliments, and maybe they even go down the path of expressing love early on in a relationship, like they don't know you. They don't know you at that point. So yeah, you have to give it time. I also think it can be helpful too, just to, before you start exploring new relationships, write down what's important to you. What are deal makers for you in relationships, and what are deal breakers, so that you have in mind, like, your firm yeses and nos as you go into these relationships. And that's where setting boundaries comes into play. If things aren't going the way that you want them to go, or if some of these red flags come up, it's a hard no, and I'm moving on, not entertaining those types of behaviors any longer. That can be helpful too. Anything else that you can think about to avoid falling victim in the future? One other thing that just popped in my mind as we were talking is just trusting your gut. I think a lot of us come out of these relationships and we just think, gosh, if I had just listened to my inner voice, trusted my gut, maybe I wouldn't have been in that for so long, or wasted time in that relationship. Just, really listening to yourself and not ignoring those feelings that come up in your body, because they will. If you've been through these relationships, your body's going to tell you when something's not right. So trusting it and listening to it is important too.
That's a really good one, is trusting your gut. I will say, and what comes to my mind when you talk about, through what you were saying, knowing what it means to self-gaslight, right? Because I think a lot of the times when we decide to ignore our guts, what we end up doing is minimizing ourselves and self-gaslighting. Oh, don't overreact because he said, maybe he didn't mean it that way, or she didn't mean it. For any men that may be watching, I'm apologize if I'm leaving out the possibility of women being abusers, but maybe he or she didn't mean it that way, and I'm being too sensitive about it. I'll give them another shot, right? And that's kind of what self-gaslighting looks like. If you have a gut feeling about something and you start catching yourself making those sort of excuses, that is what that looks like. So
Yep.
that's something that you could work on in yourself and understanding whether or not you do that and you ignore those gut feelings. Like, why are you ignoring your gut feelings and not, see or choosing to ignore some of those red flags?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, good stuff. I think this was a good segment about phases of narcissistic relationships and kind of what that feels like, what it does in your body, and things to be thinking about moving forward.